It's a feeling I can't shake. The fog wrapped around the town of Morningside like a suffocating blanket, as if the world itself was stuck in time. I could barely hear my boots on the old bridge, the wood creaking under each step. But somehow, the silence was so thick I could almost taste it. The air was cold, heavy, like it was waiting for something. My breath came in short bursts, visible in the chill, and disappeared into the fog as if the air itself were swallowing it whole. I couldn't help but think back to that night, 6 months ago. The night Grace disappeared. I could still smell the lake, earthy, wet, alive, like it was breathing, calling to her. She was so close, so carefree as she ran toward it. I screamed at her to stop, but it was too late. By the time I reached the shore, she was already gone, swallowed by the dark waters. And then the disappearances started. More people, young and old, all drawn to the lake. No one could explain it. They just vanished. A string of faces, families left with nothing but the gnawing hole of unanswered questions. The town began whispering, talking of something malevolent in that lake, something that lured people to their doom. But I wasn't one for superstition. I was a detective. I prided myself on logic, method, facts. Yet, as I stood there, staring at the black water, something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. It wasn't just the lake, it was the feeling. The sense that something was watching. Something I couldn't see but could feel pressing against my chest, creeping up my spine. The water wasn't just water. I knew that now. Something had taken Grace, and it was still out there. And if I was ever going to understand what happened, it started right here, at the edge of this cursed lake. I wasn't alone. The creak of a door pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see Luke Edwards, the fisherman. He stepped out of his shack slowly, like he was moving through a nightmare he couldn't escape. His eyes, distant and hollow, had seen too much. His family had vanished here years ago. His wife, his daughter, gone. And they said the lake took them. They said Luke knew more than he let on. "Luke," I called, my voice slicing through the thick silence. He looked up, but his eyes didn't hold any recognition, no warmth, only weariness. Years of grief and loss. "You don't want to be here, detective," he rasped. His voice was rough, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "I need answers," I said. "There's been another disappearance. Someone else drawn to the lake. What do you know about it, Luke?" He glanced at the water, his gaze distant. "There's nothing to know. It takes what it wants." I stepped closer, pressing him. "I've been investigating for months. I know the lake's involved. I need to understand why people come here and never come back. Why they disappear, or worse, change. What's happening?" Luke's expression faltered. The edges of his broken composure showed. "The lake's not like anything you've ever seen. It's not just water. It's something ancient. Something that watches, waits, it calls to you. It whispers in your mind. It knows what you want most. It knows your fears, your desires, and it gives it to you if you're willing to pay the price." My heart pounded as I processed his words. "The lake whispers? What do you mean, the lake speaks?" He shuddered, his face twisting in pain. "Once it's locked onto you, it takes you, no matter what. I couldn't stop it when it came for my family. It was already too late." A chill ran through me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but I had no choice. "I think it has my daughter," I admitted, my voice faltering for the first time. "Grace, she's been missing for 6 months. I need to know, is the lake involved?" Luke's eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of pity crossing his face, but it was gone just as quickly. "It has her. It took my family. It'll take yours too if you're not careful." My chest tightened. I could feel my pulse quicken as the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The lake wasn't just a place. It was alive. It had a will of its own. And if it had my daughter, I had to find out how to stop it. I took a step forward. "Where do I find it?" I asked, the words feeling like a dangerous invitation. Luke turned away, his shoulders heavy with years of regret. "You don't find it, detective. It finds you. And when it does, there's no going back." He retreated back into his shack, the door closing softly behind him. His words hung in the air, a dark promise that weighed on my chest. No going back. But I couldn't stop now. I couldn't let it take Grace. I couldn't let it take everything I had left. The lake was the key to everything, and I wasn't about to give up, no matter what it cost me. I turned back to the water, my eyes locked on the black surface. I didn't know how I would stop it, but I was going to find out. And I was going to get my daughter back, because no matter what, I wasn't going to let that lake win. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed far too long, reverberating through the heavy, cold air. My hand stayed on the handle for just a moment, hesitation creeping in before I finally stepped inside. The shack that Luke Edwards called home was less a place of residence and more like a tomb. A sealed-off relic, buried beneath layers of grief and isolation. The wind outside barely touched the stillness within. It was dark inside, save for the faint glow of a single lamp in the corner. Shadows stretched across the wooden floor like ghosts, and the smell hit me first. A mix of salt, decay, and something metallic, something darker that made my skin crawl. It clung to everything, the walls, the air, sinking into my lungs. I suppressed a shudder as my eyes adjusted to the gloom. The interior was cramped, cluttered with old fishing gear, worn-out boots, and stained nets piled haphazardly. A fireplace sat cold in the corner, unused for years, its hearth empty and lifeless. The walls were covered in photographs, pictures of a woman and a child, their smiles frozen in time, brighter than this desolate room. A moth-eaten armchair sat in the farthest corner next to a small wooden table littered with empty cups and a half-eaten meal abandoned long ago. I saw him then, Luke. He sat hunched at the table, his figure blending with the shadows, like he had become part of this place, worn by time and grief. His face, sharp and angular, looked like it had been carved from stone, a face that time had not been kind to. Luke Edwards was a man who had seen too much, a man who had lost too much. "Detective," he rasped, his voice rough, unused, as though it hadn't been exercised in days, maybe weeks. His gaze lingered on me, surprised, but there was no warmth in it. Only the hollow recognition of someone who had seen too many strangers come and go, asking the same questions about the lake, about his family. I closed the door behind me with a quiet thud, and the finality of it echoed through the room. The silence between us stretched, thickening like the mist outside. "You know why I'm here, don't you?" I asked, my voice calm, but there was urgency in my chest, a desperation I couldn't ignore. Luke didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted to the small, grimy window, staring out at the lake beyond. He looked at it for what felt like forever, his eyes hollow, drawn to it like something was pulling at him. I could see the weight of his past written in the deep-set wrinkles around his eyes, in the tired slump of his shoulders. "I know," he said finally, his voice barely more than a rasp. "You're looking for answers. But what if the answers you're searching for are the ones that will destroy you?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. It was too familiar, too close to the whispers that had haunted my dreams for months. "Destroy you." I swallowed hard, the pit of my stomach tightening. "You think I'm afraid of the truth?" I asked, my voice steady even as my insides twisted. Luke slowly turned back to me, his eyes dark, unreadable. For a brief moment I saw something in him. Something that resembled the man he once was before the lake had torn his life apart. "I used to think I could fight it," he said, his voice shaking as he folded his hands on the table. "Used to think I could stop it from taking my family. But the lake, it doesn't work like that." He stood up slowly, stiffly, as though even the act of moving pained him. Reaching into a cabinet by the door, he pulled out a bottle of whiskey, the label faded and peeling. Without asking, he poured himself a drink, the amber liquid sloshing in the glass before he downed it in one quick motion. I watched him, narrowing my eyes as the silence between us grew heavy with unspoken words. Luke sighed, rubbing his face, his hands trembling. "The lake doesn't just take people," he said, his voice rough. "It takes pieces of them. It takes what they want most, what they fear. It draws them in with promises, with desires they can't resist. It whispers things to them, things they can't turn away from." I stepped closer, my boots scraping on the worn floorboards. "Whispers?" I repeated, my voice sharp now. "What do you mean by that? What does it say?" Luke's eyes flicked to the window again, and I followed his gaze out toward the lake, the black waters barely visible through the fog. He seemed to shrink in that moment, the weight of his memories bearing down on him. "It promises them their deepest desires," he said slowly, as if the words were too hard to speak. "A way to escape pain, to undo what's been done, a way to find peace. But it's a lie, it's all a lie." My pulse quickened. Promises. It was what I had heard in the weeks leading up to Grace's disappearance, how she had mentioned the lake in passing, as if something about it had called to her. I remembered the look in her eyes that day by the shore, how she had stood there, waiting for something, someone, to speak to her from the depths. I hadn't reached her in time. "What did it promise your wife?" I asked, my voice quiet but insistent. "What did it promise your daughter?" Luke's face twisted in pain, his jaw tightening. For a long moment he didn't answer. I could see the war within him, whether to open up or to close the door forever. Finally, his voice came, thick with years of regret. "It promised them peace. Peace from the pain. My wife, she couldn't bear the grief of losing our daughter. She thought the lake could give her a way out. And my daughter, she was so young, so full of hope. She didn't know the cost, she didn't understand what she was asking for, but the lake knew. And it took them both." I felt a pang in my chest, a mixture of sorrow and rage. Grace, my daughter, full of life, now caught in the same trap. "It's not just a lake, is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Luke shook his head slowly. "No, Detective. It's something else. Something older. Something that feeds on our desires. And once it has you, it doesn't let go." The air in the room grew colder, thick with the scent of salt and whiskey. It felt suffocating, as though even the walls were holding their breath. My mind raced, thoughts spiraling into dark corners. The lake's whispers, its promises, its lies. And Grace, my daughter, out there somewhere, trapped in the depths. Luke lowered his head, his voice barely audible now. "You're looking for your daughter, aren't you? She's out there, somewhere in the depths. But the lake won't let her go. It won't let her go." My heart skipped a beat. My eyes narrowed. "I won't stop until I bring her back," I said, my voice cold and hard. "I'll do whatever it takes." Luke met my gaze, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Just know this, whatever you do, whatever you find, the lake always gets its price. It never gives anything without taking something in return." My fists clenched, my resolve hardening like stone. Then I'll pay it. The night was alive with the sound of silence. Thick fog swirled around me, its cold tendrils wrapping around my body as I stood at the edge of the whispering lake. The air was thick with stillness, as if the world had paused, holding its breath. The moon hung like a mere sliver behind a veil of clouds, casting the world in a dim, ghostly gray. Before me, the lake stretched into an impenetrable black mass, pulsing, alive, as if it had a heartbeat of its own, deep within its dark depths. My mind spun. Thoughts of Grace, Luke's warnings, the endless search that had brought me here, to this very place, to this very moment. My hand clenched around the strap of my bag, the chill seeping through my clothes, but I stood still, focused. The lake was more than just water. It was a trap, a lure, a force that had pulled people into its depths for centuries. And tonight, I was ready to face it, to confront whatever it was that had taken my daughter and so many others. For a moment, there was only the wind rustling through the trees. But then, just as suddenly as a flicker of light cutting through the darkness, I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, like a thread of sound carried by the breeze. Come closer. My breath caught. My heart skipped a beat. The voice was impossible to place. Neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but ancient, like something that had been waiting for centuries. Something that had been waiting for me. I blinked, my eyes narrowing, scanning the surface of the lake. Nothing. The water was still, the fog swirling around it like a veil, hiding its secrets. But the voice had been clear, there was no mistaking it. You're here for her, aren't you? The words slithered into my mind, curling around my thoughts like a vine, unbidden but impossible to ignore. My pulse quickened, and for the first time in months I felt a shiver of fear crawl up my spine. Not from the cold, but from something far darker. Grace. The name almost too painful to bear. The idea that my daughter could still be alive, somewhere beneath the water, waiting for me, was a thought I had clung to through the darkest hours of my grief. But now, hearing that voice, hearing the whisper that seemed to know exactly what I desired, I felt a sharp pang of dread. What if this isn't a rescue? Another whisper. This one softer, more intimate, a breath in my ear that made my hair stand on end. We know what you seek. We know the hunger inside you, the grief, the loss. We can give you what you want, Naomi. All you have to do is let go. The words lingered in my mind, curling around my thoughts, soft but persistent. The fog thickened, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. I took a step forward, my feet sinking into the damp earth beneath me. But then, a sudden jolt of caution cut through me. The same instinct that had kept me alive through years of investigations. The same instinct that had made me the sharp, steady detective I was. I stopped. The whispers had taken hold, but there was something wrong about them. Something off. I shook my head, steadying myself. This wasn't just about Grace. This wasn't just about finding answers. The lake wanted me to move closer. The lake wanted to draw me in. But there was something more at play here, something far darker. And then, the voice returned. This time, more urgent, more insistent. Come closer. The pain you carry, it will all be gone. The weight on your shoulders, the hole in your heart, it can all be filled. You just have to listen. My breath hitched as the words seeped into my bones, making my knees weak. The temptation was there, pulling at my resolve like an invisible hand, cold and unforgiving. The grief that had gnawed at me since Grace's disappearance was suddenly so vivid, so sharp. The empty ache in my chest felt as if it were being mirrored by the very lake itself, the black water reflecting the abyss I had carried with me all these months. "You don't have to be strong anymore, Naomi. You can be whole again. She'll be waiting for you." The weight of the words pressed on me like the water itself was reaching out to pull me under. The cold wind twisted through the trees, carrying with it the sound of the whispers, wrapping around me, suffocating me. It wasn't just my mind it was toying with. It was my heart, my very soul. The lake was alive. It wasn't just a place. It was a presence, a being that had existed for longer than I could comprehend. It had learned to manipulate the deepest desires of anyone foolish enough to listen. I took a step back, my hands trembling as I reached for the railing of the bridge. The lake knew my grief. It knew what I wanted most. But I wasn't just a victim. I was a detective, and I would not fall prey to this. You can't escape it. The voice was insistent now, a chorus of whispers blending together, becoming one singular, overwhelming presence. "You are already here, Naomi. You are already ours." I shook my head violently, as if the physical act could rid me of the voice, of the constant tug on my heart. I forced myself to step back, turning my back to the lake, focusing on the cold air, the damp wood beneath my feet. My mind screamed at me to leave, to escape. But the whispers, they were still there, lingering, wrapping around my thoughts like the fog that clung to the water. And then, just as the pressure on my mind reached its breaking point, I heard it. A single, unmistakable sound. "Mom." My breath froze. I turned back, my heart slamming in my chest. My name. It had come from the water, from the darkness, but this time it was different. It wasn't the whisper of the lake. It wasn't the promise of what it could give. This was Grace. "Grace?" I whispered, my voice hoarse, choked with fear. I stepped forward, the water so close now I could almost touch it. The surface gleamed in the dim light like glass. "Mom, I'm here." The voice was unmistakable now, soft, pleading, desperate. I felt my heart tear in two. This was it. Grace was out there, somewhere beneath the surface, calling for me. The whispers had promised me that she would be waiting, but there was something in the air I couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about my daughter anymore. This was about the lake, the thing that had claimed so many before me, the thing that had waited for me to come to it. And now it was drawing me in. A voice, familiar, beloved, a whisper full of hope and love, but also a promise that came with a cost. My legs trembled beneath me as I stood on the precipice, my hand reaching for the water, but every instinct screamed at me to stop, to run. The whispers intensified, urging me forward, but something deep inside me, told me that I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. I pulled my hand back from the water. The voice of Grace still called to me, but as I stepped away, the whisper shifted, sharp, venomous, darker. "It's already too late." And then everything went black. The cold water closed over my head like a suffocating silken shroud. For a brief moment, everything went silent. The wind, the fog, the whispers, all of it vanished, replaced by the harsh, unyielding rush of water flooding my ears. I could taste the lake on my lips, bitter and metallic. A warning. But there was no turning back now. My body trembled as I plunged deeper, the blackness around me becoming absolute. The water swallowed me, dark and endless, pulling me into a world that was never meant for the living. Every movement felt like a struggle, the weight of the lake's depths pressing against my chest, the resistance of the cold currents, as if the water itself was alive, conscious of my intrusion. I kicked against the pressure, forcing myself deeper, my lungs burning. But my mind was consumed by only one thought, Grace. The whispers had promised. Her voice, Grace's voice, it had called to me. I could still hear it in my mind, echoing louder now, clearer than before, even as the murkiness of the lake closed in around me. "Mom, I'm waiting." My breath came in short gasps, the air thick with the metallic taste of desperation. My limbs were sluggish, my movements growing slower as the freezing cold seeped into my bones. I fought against the pull of the water, my arms flailing, my eyes straining to pierce the blackness. It felt as if the lake itself was pushing back, keeping me from what I wanted most. The further I descended, the more the pressure built, until it was almost unbearable, pressing down on me like 1,000 pounds. I couldn't breathe. My vision was fading, my body growing numb, but still, the voice echoed in my mind. Grace. It was a sound that could shatter worlds. A sound that belonged to no living thing. Yet it tugged at me, urging me to descend further, deeper into the unknown. I opened my mouth to scream, but the water filled my lungs, drowning out the last of my defiance. Grace, Grace, Grace. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of voices, shifting, twisting together into something unrecognizable. I tried to focus on the image of my daughter, but it was as if the water itself was pulling me into a dream, bending time and space until the world around me warped into something dark and wrong. The weight of the lake was oppressive, like hands reaching from the abyss, dragging me deeper with every passing second. And then I saw it, a shape, a flicker of light in the distance. It was faint at first, just a glimmer, like a distant star in the inky void, but it grew stronger, drawing me toward it. I swam toward the light with renewed strength, my movements desperate, my heart hammering in my chest. The closer I got, the clearer it became. An image, a figure, illuminated by a pale, otherworldly glow. Grace. My pulse raced as I closed the distance, but something in my chest tightened with dread. The closer I came, the more wrong it all felt. The figure was too still, its form too perfect, too immaculate. It was Grace, but not. The face was too pale, the eyes too wide, as if the very soul had been emptied, leaving only a hollow, lifeless shell. "Grace?" I gasped, my voice muffled and warped by the water. The figure didn't answer, it didn't move, but the air around me thickened, as if the very water was holding its breath. My trembling hands reached out, barely able to grasp the form before me. I could feel the cold of the water seeping into my bones, the chill of the lake's touch seeping into my soul. And then, the whisper came again. This time, clearer than ever before. "You should have never come." The voice, now distorted and monstrous, rose from the depths of the lake, tearing at my consciousness. The words were not Grace's. They were something darker, something ancient. The light surrounding the figure flickered again, until it was no longer the soft glow of hope I had been following, but a cold, blue light that consumed everything around it, drowning me in an all-encompassing darkness. My hand shook as I reached for the figure, and as my fingers brushed against it, something cold and unnatural jolted through me. It wasn't just the chill of the water anymore, it was something else. A force, pulling me in. Something alive beneath the surface of the lake, its grip tightening around me. My vision blurred as the water began to swirl, pulling me in every direction at once. No, I thought, panicked. I'm almost there. I have to save her. But the more I struggled, the more the lake pushed back, its currents violent, its depths pulling me deeper, further from the surface. The whispers began to multiply, the voices now shrill, pressing into my skull, each one a jagged shard of reality tearing my mind apart. It's too late. You cannot save her. The words cut through me like a blade, and I screamed, but it was drowned by the sound of the water rushing around me, the voices filling my mind with promises of things I could never understand. The world began to fragment around me. The water grew colder. My limbs felt heavier, slower, until it was as if the lake itself was absorbing me. She's ours now. My chest ached, my body trembling, my lungs burning as I was dragged deeper. My eyes blurred as the water pressed in on me, my body feeling like it was dissolving, pulled apart by the lake's insidious will. My fingers gripped at the water, desperate, but they could find nothing to hold on to, only the endless abyss, the suffocating pressure that pressed down on me, more and more with every passing moment. She's ours, and soon you will be too. The voice that had once been soft and pleading was now a guttural, menacing growl, a sound that reverberated through my very soul. The lake had no mercy. It had no compassion. It took, and it would never let go. My vision grew dark. My breath was slowing, the ache in my chest unbearable. I was drowning. No, not just drowning. I was being consumed by the lake, by the thing beneath the surface. The thing that had waited for me, just as it had waited for all the others. And as my body succumbed to the weight of the water, my last thought, my last shred of clarity, was not of myself, but of Grace. The daughter I had loved, the daughter I had fought for. And then, like the faintest wisp of smoke, the thought vanished. The lake had taken me, just as it had taken so many before. And with me gone, Grace's voice whispered through the water, the lake's hunger satisfied for now, until the next soul dared to listen. The descent felt eternal. The cold water closed in around me like a suffocating silken shroud, each movement a struggle against the oppressive weight of the lake's grip. My body, once buoyant, now felt as if it was being dragged deeper, suffocated by the very depths I had willingly entered. The pressure crushed against my chest, the cold seeping into my bones, drowning out all thoughts except one: Grace. The whispers that had followed me, promising me answers, had faded into an unbearable silence. But in that silence my mind screamed for her, screamed for the child I had failed to protect. I remember the last thing I felt before my consciousness began to slip away, the darkness surrounding me, pressing me deeper, colder. I had been so sure I was close to finding Grace. But the lake had other plans, and it had no intention of letting me find my daughter unless I paid the price. Just as my breath became too shallow and the last flicker of my will began to die, something strange happened. A flicker, a glimmer of recognition far below, just beyond the veil of darkness. My heart raced again, despite the pain, despite the overwhelming pressure of the water. The presence below me, was that Grace? The word barely formed in my throat. My limbs felt like lead, too heavy to move. But the pull toward the light, toward her, was undeniable. It was Grace. I could feel it in my very bones, my soul. My daughter was waiting for me in the black depths. I fought against the pressure, kicking, reaching, my eyes straining through the murk. Every muscle in my body screamed for release, but I forced myself forward. The lake was no longer just an entity, it was something malicious, something that fed on my pain, my grief, and my deepest desires. It wanted to break me, but I refused to let it. Not now, not when I was so close. With everything I had left, I pushed toward the light, but the closer I got, the more wrong it felt. The figure, Grace, was still, too perfect. Her face, her eyes vacant, hollow. Not the daughter I had once known. The gleam in her eyes sent a chill through me, an ice-cold fear that tightened around my chest. Grace, I choked, reaching out, my hands trembling. But before I could touch her, the light around her flickered, distorting into a sickening shade of blue, a cold hue that drained the warmth from my very soul. And then I heard it. "It's too late, Naomi." The voice wasn't Grace's. It wasn't even a voice at all. It was the voice of the lake. Ancient, endless, deep. It filled my mind with suffocating weight, a death knell ringing in my ears. My breath caught in my throat, the words crushing me. "You cannot take her back. She is mine now." My heart twisted. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I wanted to swim, to reach out, but my limbs betrayed me. The cold consumed me, devoured me from the inside out. The lake had already claimed Grace. I had come too late. Then the truth hit me. Hard. To save her, you must take her place. The clarity was overwhelming. It shattered every fragment of my fading consciousness. The lake had made its offer, its twisted, sinister offer. To take Grace's place, I would have to let go. I would have to sacrifice myself. And in doing so, I would save her. Tears blurred my vision, but I locked my eyes onto Grace's. There was no recognition in her eyes, no trace of life. She had been taken. She had become part of the lake, part of its insidious, unyielding force. "It's the only way," the voice whispered again. "The only way." My chest tightened, the last remnants of hope slipping away. The sacrifice was the only way. I had failed Grace once. I would not fail her again, not like this. Not when I had the chance to save her, even if it meant giving up everything. With the last strength I had, I reached out, feeling the cold, lifeless water seep into my very soul. I understood now. The lake had taken her. But if I gave myself to it, if I accepted its call, Grace would be free. Grace would be saved. With one final breath, I closed my eyes, letting the overwhelming pressure of the water claim me completely. I felt myself let go, not just of the air in my lungs, not just of my body, but of everything, my fears, my pain, my grief. I gave it all to the lake. The moment my body succumbed to the cold darkness, a silence fell over the lake. So complete, so final, it felt as though time itself had stopped. And then, slowly, a figure emerged from the lake. It was Grace, but not Grace. Her skin was pale and lifeless, her eyes empty and hollow, reflecting nothing but the dark abyss. Her once bright, innocent face was twisted with the unmistakable mark of the lake, the same hollow gaze that had overtaken all the others. Grace stepped onto the shore, the water dripping from her like oil. The lake had claimed her, and in exchange, I had given myself up to its insatiable hunger. The cycle had begun again, but as my body sank into the depths, consumed by the water, the whispers started once more, swirling around the lake like an invisible force. She is ours now. And as the last traces of my presence disappeared, Grace stood at the water's edge, hearing the whispers grow louder. The lake had taken me, and now it called to her. The echoes of a mother's love and a child's grief mingled with the endless pull of the lake, and the cycle would continue. The lake was eerily calm now, its surface like a black mirror reflecting the twisted branches of the trees surrounding it. A thick veil of fog lingered on the shore, swallowing the distant sounds of the town, creating a world where nothing could be seen but the dark, relentless water. Grace stood at the edge, her feet submerged in the shallow waters, her pale skin gleaming unnaturally under the faint light of the moon. The chill in the air seemed to settle around her, cocooning her in a coldness that matched the emptiness in her eyes. She stared at the water as if waiting for something, for someone. But her gaze never wavered, never flinched, as if her very soul had already been swallowed by the lake long ago. Behind her, the world seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with the weight of what had transpired, the price Naomi had paid. The dark, silent lake seemed to pulse in rhythm with Grace's stillness, as though it too was aware of the shift, aware that it had claimed what it wanted, and now it was content. The whispers, faint but persistent, lingered just beneath the surface of the water, curling around her like a forgotten melody, just loud enough to be felt in the deepest corners of her mind. But Grace, she did not hear the whispers, not the way Naomi had. She didn't need to hear them anymore. She had become one with the lake, just as it had promised. The waters rippled behind her, and she turned slowly, almost unnaturally so, her expression unchanged, her body stiff with something not quite alive. The figure emerging from the water was her mother, Naomi, her once vibrant face now ashen, her body a pale reflection of what it had been. Her clothes were tattered, waterlogged, her hair floating around her like dark seaweed. She moved as if her bones no longer worked properly, each step slow and deliberate, as though she were learning to walk again, her every movement a contradiction, so unnatural, yet so unmistakably real. Naomi's eyes locked onto Grace's, and for the briefest of moments something flickered in the depths of her gaze. Something not yet lost, something still fighting to reach through the shroud of the lake's influence. But as the moment passed, it vanished, swallowed by the all-consuming darkness of the water. Grace's lips barely parted, and her voice, distant and hollow, spoke with the same eerie calm. "You came back." Naomi, or what was left of her, blinked, her gaze confused. "I'm here. For you." Her voice was not quite her own, a rasping echo that barely carried over the wind. The lake had taken everything, her body, her mind, her soul, and now it had left her only a shell. She had made the sacrifice to save Grace, but in doing so she had lost more than just her life. She had lost everything that had once been Naomi Taylor, the detective, the mother, the protector. All that remained was an echo of her love, a shadow of her grief. Grace looked down at the water, the surface trembling slightly, as if responding to her thoughts. There was no fear in her, no sadness, not even confusion. The lake had stripped all of that from her the moment it claimed her, the moment she had been taken from Naomi. But there was something else, something deep inside her that she couldn't quite explain, but it pulled at her, gnawing at the edges of her mind, a distant feeling of something wrong. "You shouldn't be here," Grace whispered, her voice soft, almost regretful. Naomi, her eyes dull, only stared at her daughter with empty, glassy eyes. "I'm sorry. I couldn't save you." For the first time, something flickered in Grace's expression, a trace of humanity, a shadow of recognition. But it was fleeting, a mere blink in time, before it was replaced by the hollow gaze of the lake's influence. And then, a horrifying truth dawned upon Naomi. It wasn't just that she had failed to save Grace, it was something much darker, something deeper. The realization pierced her, cold and sharp as the water itself. The lake had not freed her daughter. The lake had kept her, and it hadn't given Naomi the opportunity to save her. It had only twisted the sacrifice into its own insidious game. Grace wasn't the only one to be sacrificed. Naomi had become part of the lake too, a lost soul bound to its depths, but in doing so, she had inadvertently given her daughter to it as well. The lake didn't just claim souls, it twisted them. It fed on their pain, their grief, their desire to be reunited. And the cycle it had begun with Naomi was far from over. Grace was still trapped. They both were. The very thought shattered Naomi's fractured mind. The lake had won. It had claimed her, claimed Grace, and in doing so, it had woven them both into its eternal cycle. No one left its depths, not truly, not ever. the lake didn't let go. It held its prisoners in an endless loop, feeding off their despair, their desperate need for reunion, only to shatter it again with each attempt at escape. Naomi's voice broke through the stillness. "Grace, it will never stop. It won't let you go. It never lets go." Grace's hollow gaze shifted to her mother, her face expressionless. She took a step back, the water now at her waist, her eyes locked with Naomi's. And for the first time since her arrival, Grace spoke with a new, unsettling certainty in her voice. "It's too late now, Mom." The words rang through Naomi's chest like a death knell, and in that moment she understood the truth, the terrible, devastating truth that she had been too blind to see. It wasn't just the lake that had trapped them. It was their own desires, their own need to hold on to bring the past back. That was what had drawn them both in. And now Naomi was a part of that cycle, just as Grace was. Naomi tried to move, to reach for her daughter, to make one final attempt to break free, but it was too late. She was already slipping further into the lake's grasp. The dark waters lapped around her legs, cold and relentless, pulling her deeper. Grace, standing there, began to turn toward the water, the whispers growing louder, echoing in Naomi's mind, their voices now impossibly close. The truth was unrelenting. It had always been there, buried in the deepest recesses of her mind, but now it was undeniable. The lake did not release. It did not give. It did not care about the sacrifice. It only took. And as Naomi's final breath escaped her lips, she understood that she, too, was part of the lake now, part of its endless, all-consuming hunger. Grace's head dipped slightly as she listened to the whispers once more, a faint smile crossing her lips, her eyes reflecting the lake's eternal promise. And the cycle began again.